I'm a 28-year-old guy, and up until recently, I thought my family was close. Not perfect, definitely not, but we had a system. When conflicts got serious, we voted. Majority rules. It was supposed to be fair, a way to keep us together no matter what. Looking back, I should have seen the cracks forming long before things blew up, but I didn't. And now I don't have a family anymore. The whole thing started out of nowhere. One minute, I was having a normal day, and the next, I was being accused of stealing $5,000 from the family safe. A safe I didn't even know the combination to. It started with a text from my mom, telling me to come over immediately. No explanation, just urgency. When I got there, my parents, my younger sister Ava, 22F, and my cousin Jake, 30M, were already sitting in the living room looking serious. Other family members, some aunts, uncles, and cousins, were hovering nearby, like they'd been called in for something big. It felt like an intervention, but I had no idea what for. My dad spoke first. The family safe was open. $5,000 was missing, and apparently, all fingers were pointing at me. I laughed at first, because it sounded ridiculous. But no one else was laughing. Ava claimed she had seen me near the safe earlier that week. Jake backed her up, saying I had recently mentioned struggling with money. That was true. I had been talking about some unexpected expenses, but I never asked anyone for money, and I definitely didn't steal from the family. I told them they were wrong, that I had no reason to take anything, and I didn't even know where the safe was kept. My parents just stared at me, and then my mom said, "If you didn't do it, then who did?" That's when I realized this wasn't just an accusation. They had already made up their minds. I asked if they had any proof, actual proof, not just Ava's word or Jake's assumption. But they just kept pressing me, saying I should just admit it and take responsibility. I kept repeating myself. I didn't take anything. Then my mom turned to the rest of the family and said something that changed everything. "We stand together, unless we're forced apart." My father's voice carried the weight of tradition, a rule passed down from his parents before him. Whenever there was conflict, a vote was the final say. It had been used for everything, from settling disputes over inheritances to determining who would host family holidays, but never for something this extreme. 11 people, a simple yes or no. Do they believe me, or do they cut me off until I do the right thing and return the money? I sat there as one by one, hands went up. Yes, yes, yes. 8 out of 11. That was it. That was all it took. My own parents voted against me. My sister, of course. My cousin, no surprise. A couple of uncles, a cousin's wife, people I'd grown up with, people I thought had my back. I was given a day to pack my things and leave, until you make things right. That's what my dad said. My phone was immediately removed from the family plan. By the time I got home, I was blocked by most of my relatives on social media, like I had never existed. The only person who reached out was my aunt, my dad's sister. She said she didn't think I did it, but she couldn't go against the rest of the family. All she could do was tell me to take care of myself. I don't know what was worse, the betrayal or how easily they erased me. I left with just a suitcase and my car. No backup plan, no real support system outside of a few friends. I was angry. I was hurt. But more than anything, I was confused. None of it made sense. And that's when it hit me. Someone had set me up. Ava had been begging our parents for money for weeks. They refused to fund some trip she wanted. And Jake had a history of gambling. He borrowed money all the time and never paid it back. The more I thought about it, the more it didn't add up. The timeline, the accusations, the fact that I wasn't even home the day Ava claimed she saw me near the safe. They had lied, and they had won. But if they thought I was just going to disappear and take the fall for something I didn't do, they were dead wrong. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I crashed at my best friend Daniel's place that night. He had been my closest friend since college, and when I told him what happened, he looked ready to drive to my parents' house himself. Instead, he tossed me a spare key and said, "Stay as long as you need." By morning, I had a plan. If Ava and Jake had set me up, they must have slipped up somewhere. I just had to find it. Daniel and I sat down and went over everything. Ava claimed she saw me near the safe earlier that week, but I wasn't even home the day she was talking about. And Jake, his only proof was that I had mentioned struggling with money. That was it. No security footage, no fingerprints, nothing but their word. That's when I remembered something. Ava had been pestering our parents for money recently. She wanted to go on a trip, and they shut her down. And Jake, he had a gambling problem. He always had some excuse about how this time he was going to win it all back, but he never did. Daniel pulled out a notepad. So they both needed money. They both had a reason to steal it, and they both made sure you got blamed. It was starting to add up. I went through my phone to check where I had been the day of the so-called theft. Text from my coworker Mark confirmed I had stayed late at work that night. He had messaged me about grabbing food after, and I had replied, "Still at work. Might be another hour." That message was time-stamped, clear proof that I wasn't anywhere near the safe when Ava claimed I was. I called Mark and asked if he remembered that night. He did. In fact, he still had his receipt from the fast food place we stopped at afterward. The timestamp on it, exactly when Ava was claiming I had been sneaking around the house. That was my first solid piece of proof. But what did proof matter to a family that had already decided I was guilty? Would facts change their minds, or was this just another battle in a war I had already lost? Then, something unexpected happened. My aunt, the only person who had secretly reached out to me, sent a message. She kept it vague, but the meaning was clear. Be careful. I overheard Ava and Jake talking before the family meeting. They were making sure their stories matched. That was it. No follow-up, no explanation, but it was enough. They weren't just guessing or assuming I took the money. They had planned this. I needed to test them. I sent Ava a simple text. I know what you did. Less than a minute later, I was blocked. That was all the confirmation I needed. Next, I called Jake. Unlike Ava, he didn't block me, but he didn't sound too happy to hear from me either. I kept my voice calm. I have proof that I didn't take the money, I said, and I'm ready to take it to the police. There was silence. Then, a quick, nervous response. What proof? He took the bait. I have a witness. Someone who saw where I was that night. Someone who's willing to talk. I could hear his breathing pick up. He was panicking. You don't have to get involved, I continued. If you come clean now, it'll be easier for you. But if this goes further, you know what happens next. That set him off. He started demanding details. Who the witness was, what exactly I had, whether I had talked to the police yet. I didn't answer. I just let the silence drag on. Then I ended the call. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. It was my mom. Her voice was tense, hesitant. She wasn't apologizing. She was searching for a way to control the situation before it spiraled beyond their grip. She wasn't worried about the truth. She was worried about appearances. I heard you're thinking about going to the police, she said. Not. You better not. Not. How dare you? She was worried. I didn't say much, just told her I was considering my options. She hesitated, then asked if we could talk. Not in person, just over the phone. That told me one thing. Ava and Jake were scrambling. They knew I was getting closer. And someone, maybe Ava, maybe Jake, was about to crack. I sent Jake another message. You have one chance to tell the truth before I take this further. Less than a minute later, my phone rang. Jake, his voice was different this time, shaky, rushed. He wasn't trying to act tough anymore. He went straight to the point, asking if I really had proof, if I had already gone to the police. I didn't answer his questions. I let the silence hang between us. Then he slipped. I didn't think they'd take it this far. That was it. He tried to backtrack immediately, saying I was twisting his words, but I didn't let up. I pushed him, repeating what he just said. The more he talked, the worse it got for him. His excuses didn't hold up. He blamed Ava, then changed his story, and blamed the family, then tried to act like it was just a misunderstanding. I kept him talking, and I recorded every second. After hanging up, I sent the recording to my aunt. She didn't reply right away, but when she did, it was just one sentence. That's more than enough. Then I sent it to my mother with a message. Still think I stole the money? She didn't respond for hours. Then finally, this is complicated. Not an apology, not even an admission that they were wrong, just more avoidance. Then my dad called. His tone wasn't like my mom's. He was direct. He wanted me to come home to talk things over. Daniel was immediately suspicious. You're not going alone, he said. He was right. If they were calling me back after everything, it meant something was shifting. I needed backup. I called my aunt. She agreed to come. When we got to my parents' house, it wasn't just them waiting. Ava and Jake were there too. It wasn't a conversation. It was another setup. Ava started talking first, acting like I was overreacting. She tried to make it sound like Jake was joking in the recording, that I was taking things too far. I cut her off and looked at Jake. Why did you call me in a panic? Jake didn't answer. I pressed him again. If I didn't have proof, why were you so scared? Ava kept trying to speak over me, but Jake cracked. He threw up his hands and admitted it. They had planned it together. Ava stole the money, and Jake backed her up, because they knew the family would believe them over me. My mother gasped. My father clenched his jaw. Ava went pale. Then, as fast as she lost control, she tried to spin it, saying she never meant for it to go this far, saying she thought I'd just return the money to keep the peace. I wasn't playing that game. Then my dad did something I didn't expect. He suggested another vote, one to decide what happens to Ava and Jake. Now that the truth was out, the living room was tense. My father stood at the center, looking around at the family members who had gathered again. The same system that had once condemned me was now being used against them. But was it justice, or just another excuse to avoid personal accountability? Had anyone ever questioned this rule before? Or was it only now, when their loyalty was tested, that they realized how flawed it was? Now that the truth was out, my father insisted the family had to handle it the right way, as if another vote could undo the damage they had already done. Ava wasted no time trying to take control. She shifted the story, claiming she did what she did to protect the family from unnecessary drama. She painted herself as someone who had been looking out for everyone, as if framing me for theft was some kind of selfless act. Jake, on the other hand, said nothing. He sat stiffly, eyes down, hands clenched. He wasn't defending himself because he knew there was nothing to defend. The truth was already out. I let Ava talk. I let her spin her story. Then when she was done, I made it clear what her lies had done to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just laid it all out. The vote that exiled me. The humiliation of being branded a thief. The fact that my own parents turned their backs on me with no real proof. The family was divided. Some people, mainly my parents and a couple of uncles, wanted to move on and not make things worse. Others weren't so forgiving. My aunt, the only one who had secretly supported me, spoke up for the first time in front of everyone. She said this wasn't just a mistake. This was manipulation, and there had to be consequences. Jake finally muttered something that sounded like an apology, but it was weak, and everyone knew it. He wasn't fighting this because he had already lost. Ava, though, kept her shoulders squared, her voice steady. She didn't beg or plead. She doubled down, insisting that everything was a misunderstanding, and somehow, despite the overwhelming proof against her, a handful of relatives still looked uncertain, because for years, Ava had always been believed. Instead of apologizing, she turned on me. She claimed I was the one dragging this out, that I was making things worse by refusing to let it go. Then it was time for the vote. 11 people, just like before. Jake was voted out, 8 against 3. He nodded once, not surprised, not angry, just done. He got up and left without a word. He knew he had burned every bridge. Ava, though, she barely made it through. 6 people voted in her favor, just enough to let her stay. She smirked. It was small, barely there, but I saw it. She thought she had won. She was wrong. I looked at my parents. I'm done, I said. I didn't care that Ava was technically still part of the family. That didn't mean I had to be. I walked out, this time on my terms. Daniel and my aunt followed. I didn't look back. The family might have tried to fix things with another vote, but the damage was already done. Some fractures never heal. For the first time in my life, I was done with my family. No more trying to prove myself. No more hoping they'd see reason. After the vote, I walked out, and I didn't look back. Daniel had already made it clear I could stay as long as I needed, so I focused on moving forward. No more wasting energy on people who turned their backs on me without a second thought. Work kept me busy, and I started making plans for my future. Things I should have been doing instead of getting dragged into their chaos. A week passed without a word from them. Then, out of nowhere, Jake reached out. He wanted to meet, said he had something to tell me. I debated ignoring him, but curiosity won. If he had more to say, I wanted to hear it. We met at a small diner on the edge of town. He looked different, tired, beaten down. Then he told me everything. Ava had planned the whole thing. She was the one who stole the money, then convinced him to back her up when the heat turned on her. He owed her a favor for covering for him in the past, and she used it to rope him into this. He admitted he never thought it would go this far. He assumed the family would pressure me. I'd confess, and then they'd move on. But when they completely cut me off, Ava refused to back down. She didn't care that I was telling the truth. She just wanted to protect herself. Jake regretted everything, but regret wasn't enough. He admitted that at first, he had seen it as a way to protect himself. Ava had given him a way out, a way to shift the target. He had told himself it was just a temporary lie, that the family would pressure OP, he'd confess, and things would return to normal. But he hadn't counted on the family turning so completely against OP. He hadn't counted on his own exile. He told me he was sorry, but sorry didn't undo what had already happened. I recorded everything. He agreed to it, said he didn't care anymore. Then I sent the recording to my parents. I expected something: shock, maybe anger at Ava, some kind of acknowledgement that they had been wrong. Instead, they ignored it. Hours passed. Nothing. Then I found out why. A cousin, one of the people who had voted against me, sent me a message. Ava was already spinning the story. She told my parents Jake was lying out of bitterness, that he was trying to drag her down with him now that he was cut off. And they believed her. That was it. That was the moment I knew. No amount of proof would ever change their minds. Ava could lie, steal, manipulate, and they would always protect her. I could be standing in front of them with undeniable evidence, and they'd still look for a reason to defend her. I blocked their numbers. Every single one of them. No more hoping for an apology that would never come. No more trying to fix something that was beyond repair. My aunt, Daniel, and even Jake stood by me. Jake knew he had messed up beyond repair, but at least he wasn't lying to himself anymore. Then the cracks in Ava's image started to form. One cousin reached out. They had believed Ava before, but now they weren't so sure. The recording had spread. More family members started questioning what really happened. I didn't care anymore. I wasn't trying to fix things with them, but it was the beginning of something. Ava wasn't untouchable, and for the first time I felt free. No more waiting for validation from people who never really saw me. I had wasted enough time. Now I was finally moving on. It started slowly, little whispers here and there. At first it was just a few cousins asking questions, small doubts creeping in about Ava's version of the story. Then those whispers grew louder. I heard about it through Daniel first. Someone from my extended family had reached out to him, asking if the recording of Jake's confession was real. Word had spread further than I expected. People who originally believed Ava were starting to rethink things, and then Jake spoke out. He had nothing left to lose, no one left to protect. Since the family had already cut him off, he started telling everyone the truth. That Ava had planned everything, that she had framed me, that she had pressured him into backing her up. At first, people dismissed it, but then more details started to line up. My aunt, who had stayed quiet for most of this, finally had enough. She called out my parents in the family group chat, laying everything out. She made it clear. Ava was the real culprit, and my parents had let it happen. That was when things really started to unravel. Some relatives distanced themselves from Ava completely. Others, mainly my parents' closest supporters, refused to accept it. They clung to the idea that Ava had just made a mistake, and that I was making things worse by refusing to let it go. Ava panicked, but she wasn't apologizing. She was rewriting history. She called one cousin after another, not to plead for forgiveness, but to plant doubts. Jake has always been a liar. She whispered to one, revenge. She told another, she wasn't looking for redemption. She was looking for control, saying that Jake was only speaking out because he was bitter, that I had somehow manipulated him into turning on her. She reached out to cousins, aunts, uncles, anyone who would listen, but it wasn't working like it used to. For the first time, people weren't automatically taking her side. Then the unexpected happened. A few relatives who had voted against me, who had sided with Ava and Jake without question, started reaching out. Some apologized outright, while others danced around their guilt, trying to justify why they had believed the lie for so long. They had believed Ava, they had trusted my parents, and now they weren't so sure anymore. It didn't matter though. My parents refused to budge. Instead of acknowledging their mistake, they turned on the relatives who changed sides. They started claiming I was the one manipulating people, that I was dragging the family apart. That's when I knew they were never going to change. It didn't matter how much proof there was, how many people saw through Ava. My parents had already chosen their side, and they were never going to admit they were wrong. Even after everything, that realization hit hard. Cutting them off had been necessary, but the finality of it started to settle in. Meanwhile, Jake made a decision of his own. With no one left in the family supporting him, he decided to leave town and start fresh somewhere else. He didn't ask for sympathy. He just told me he was done trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. Then came the final insult. My parents sent me a long message, accusing me of dividing the family. They didn't say Ava was innocent. They didn't say she was guilty. They just blamed me for refusing to move on. They still wouldn't hold her accountable. That was it. I blocked them. My aunt reminded me that choosing peace wasn't abandonment. It was self-preservation. She was right. I wasn't the one who broke this family, but I was done trying to fix it. For a while, it seemed like Ava had won. I was gone. Jake was out of the picture, and my parents were still blindly defending her. She must have thought she was untouchable, but the cracks in her control were already forming. It started with whispers from extended family. A cousin mentioned that Ava had been spending money recklessly. Designer bags, expensive dinners, weekend trips. It wasn't subtle, she flaunted it. And yet no one had questioned it before. Not when she had gotten bailed out of financial trouble before. Not when she had borrowed from family and never repaid them. She had always been their problem child, but they had always been willing to clean up her mess, until now. The problem? She didn't. She had always relied on my parents and other family members to support her. But with everything that had happened, people were starting to pull away. The same relatives who once voted me out were realizing something. They had given Ava everything, and she had never given anything in return. Then the real trouble began. My parents, who had always covered for her, started feeling the strain. Ava was coming to them for more and more money. At first, they helped without question, but the requests didn't stop. They got bigger. Rent, bills, emergencies that conveniently kept appearing. My parents were starting to struggle. Then Ava lost her job. She had never been the most responsible employee, but this time, she didn't even try to fix it. Instead of looking for a new one, she expected the family to carry her. And then came the final straw. A cousin reached out to me with something shocking. Ava had tried to take out a personal loan in our mother's name, without permission. That was it. The moment my parents had no choice but to face reality, they were forced to admit it. Ava wasn't the perfect daughter they had always defended. She wasn't the victim in all this. She was the problem. By now, most of the family had backed away. The same people who once cut me off were now refusing to help her. She was burning through every last bridge she had. Desperate, she lashed out in the family group chat. A long, angry rant blaming everyone but herself. She called people out one by one, twisting the narrative, claiming she was the real victim. But no one was falling for it anymore. One by one, people left the chat. And just like that, she was alone. Jake had left town. I had cut them off. Her supporters had abandoned her. She had no one left. Then out of nowhere, my parents reached out to me. A vague message about rebuilding the family. No apology, no accountability, just excuses, longing and an attempt to smooth things over without actually fixing anything. I didn't reply. I knew exactly what it was. They weren't reaching out because they regretted what they had done. They were reaching out because they had lost Ava, and that wasn't my problem anymore. For the first time in my life, I wasn't tied to their mess. I had my own life, my own future, and I wasn't going to waste another second looking back. Ava had built her world on lies and manipulation, and in the end, it had all come crashing down. She had no one to blame but herself. A few weeks passed, and Ava's downfall was complete. A cousin who had once sided with her confirmed what I already suspected. She had burned every last bridge. No one was willing to help her anymore. The family had finally seen her for what she was. Without me or Jake to shift blame onto, without my parents constantly covering for her, she had nothing left. Some relatives ignored her entirely. Others had directly told her they were done. Even the ones who still supported my parents weren't lifting a finger for Ava anymore. And now, my parents had to deal with the reality they had created. They had spent years defending Ava, making excuses, protecting her from consequences. But now that she had no one else to manipulate, she turned all her attention to them. The same people who threw me away without hesitation were now realizing just how much they had enabled her. Then my mother reached out again. A long message, full of empty words about unity, as if rewriting the past would erase what they had done. No apology, no ownership of their betrayal. Just a desperate attempt to regain control now that Ava had become too much of a burden for them to carry. About how things had gotten out of control, and how we needed to find a way back to each other. It wasn't an apology. Not once did she acknowledge what she and my father had done to me. There was no ownership of the fact that they had thrown me away with no proof, no remorse for how they had let Ava ruin my life. It was all about moving forward without actually addressing the damage. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Then out of nowhere, Jake reached out. He had been quiet since he left town, but now, he wanted to talk. He wasn't making excuses or trying to rewrite the past. He told me that getting away from everything had given him clarity, that he fully owned what he did, that he regretted every choice that led to this point. It was different from my parents' message. He didn't blame Ava, didn't act like he was a victim in all of this. He just admitted that he had betrayed me, and that no matter what happened, he had to live with that. I appreciated his honesty, but I had no interest in rebuilding anything with him, and he understood. Then, some relatives started reaching out again. The same ones who had cut me off without hesitation were now trying to convince me to reconnect with my parents. Not because they thought my parents had changed, but because my parents were struggling. That was my moment of clarity. It had never been about me. They didn't care about the damage that had been done. They just didn't want to feel uncomfortable about what they had allowed to happen. I sent my parents one final message. Unless they could fully acknowledge what they had done, unless they could take real responsibility, they would not be part of my life. No more pretending. No more brushing things under the rug. I never got a response, and I never heard from Ava again. Not that I expected to. She was too prideful to admit she lost. For the first time I felt free. No more waiting for an apology that would never come. No more trying to fix a family that had never truly been on my side. I focused on my future, my career, my friendships, the life I should have been building instead of wasting energy on people who never saw me as more than a scapegoat. In the end, I never had to destroy Ava. She did that all by herself. I'm 29 years old, and my life, for the most part, has been pretty straightforward. I work as a project manager at a tech company, a job that keeps me busy but also makes me proud of what I've accomplished. I've built a solid reputation there. I'm known for being reliable, diligent, and a bit of a perfectionist. It's not an easy industry, but I thrive on solving problems and staying ahead of deadlines. That's who I am, someone who works hard for what they have. I come from a family of 5. My parents, both semi-retired, live in the house I grew up in. Then there's Rachel, my older sister. She's 32 and has always been considered the golden child. She was that kid in school who aced everything, the one everyone said would go far. But lately, things haven't been great for her. She's faced a string of setbacks in her career, jobs lost, failed ventures. She blames bad luck or people not understanding her. I'll admit, we've never had the best relationship. Rachel and I have always been competitive, and I'd be lying if I said her sarcasm and passive aggressiveness didn't get to me. On the other hand, there's Mark, my younger brother. He's 25 and pretty laid back. If there's ever tension in the house, Mark is the one cracking jokes and keeping the peace. He's one of those people who seems immune to drama, which I admire. While Rachel and I lock horns, Mark stays neutral. It's refreshing, really. I've always felt like he's the only one in the family who truly sees me without judgment. Growing up, my family wasn't exactly perfect, but we were close. My parents worked hard to give us a good life. My mom especially, she's the glue that holds us together. She's warm, supportive, and has a knack for making everyone feel like they're her favorite. Maybe that's why it's so jarring when things feel off. You know that gut feeling when something isn't right, but you can't put your finger on it? I've been getting that a lot lately, and it all seems to point back to Rachel. A few weeks ago, Rachel moved back in with our parents after losing another job. It was a high-profile position at some fancy company, and she doesn't talk much about why it didn't work out. My parents, especially Mom, have been bending over backward to support her. I get it. Family helps family, but the way they coddle her sometimes feels unfair. They've always been softer on Rachel. Meanwhile, I've had to prove myself over and over again. That's just how it's always been. The tipping point for me was a recent family dinner. I had some exciting news to share, a promotion at work. It was a big deal for me, something I'd worked years to achieve. When I told everyone, my parents and Mark were thrilled. They congratulated me and asked about my plans to celebrate. But Rachel? She barely looked up from her plate. When she finally did, she smirked and said, "Well, some people just have all the luck, don't they?" Her tone wasn't congratulatory, it was dismissive, almost bitter. That comment stuck with me. I tried to brush it off at first, Rachel being Rachel, right? But later that night, I overheard her talking to Mom in the kitchen. She was venting about me, saying things like, "It's so unfair. He always gets everything handed to him. He doesn't even have to try." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did she really think that? That everything I've achieved was just handed to me? The truth is, my job isn't easy. There are late nights, endless meetings, and constant pressure to deliver. I've made sacrifices to get to where I am, and hearing Rachel dismiss all of that felt like a slap in the face. But what hurt more was my mom's response. She didn't defend me or correct Rachel. Instead, she just said, "I know, honey. It's been a tough time for you. Don't worry, things will get better." That was the moment something shifted for me. I started questioning everything. My place in the family, the dynamics we've all grown used to. Why does Rachel always get a pass? Why is her bitterness overlooked while my hard work is downplayed? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for sure, something needed to change. I just didn't realize how messy things would get. When Rachel moved back home, it wasn't exactly a surprise. She had lost another job. This time it was a high-profile position at a company she had boasted about for months. The details of why she left were murky. Rachel didn't go into specifics, and frankly, I didn't want to pry. It wasn't my place. Still, seeing her back at our parents' house brought up old feelings. Rachel has always had this aura of being untouchable, the one everyone assumed would be wildly successful. Watching her return home after yet another setback felt strange. I felt bad for her, sure, but it also reminded me how different our paths have been. Our parents, especially Mom, have been incredibly supportive of her. They don't just offer her a roof over her head, they cushion her with constant reassurance. Mom cooks her favorite meals, Dad stays quiet when Rachel snaps at him, and the atmosphere in the house shifts to accommodate her mood. Don't get me wrong, I understand that family is supposed to be there for you when times are tough. But sometimes it feels like Rachel gets more than her fair share of sympathy, and when she's dismissive or rude, it's like nobody wants to call her out on it. I don't spend much time at my parents' house, but I try to visit for family dinners once a week. It's one of those things I do because I love them, even though it can be a little exhausting. A few weeks ago, I decided to share some good news with them during dinner. I'd been promoted to a senior role at work, something I'd been working toward for years. It was a huge accomplishment, and I was proud of myself. When I told them, my parents and Mark were thrilled. They asked about my new responsibilities, congratulated me, and even started talking about how we should celebrate. But Rachel? Her reaction was underwhelming, to say the least. She barely glanced up from her plate, and when she finally did, her response stung. "Well, some people just have all the luck, don't they?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Everyone else went quiet for a moment, unsure how to respond. I forced a smile and tried to change the subject, but the comment stuck with me. It wasn't just what she said, it was the tone, the implication that everything I've worked for was somehow handed to me. It wasn't the first time Rachel had said something like that, but it hurt all the same. Later that night, I heard her talking to Mom in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their voices carried through the quiet house. Rachel was venting, her voice filled with frustration. "It's just so unfair," she said. "He always gets everything. The promotions, the praise, it's like he can do no wrong. Meanwhile, I'm out here struggling, and nobody cares." My heart sank as I listened. Did she really think that about me? That my life was somehow easy? It wasn't. I've worked hard to get to where I am. Late nights, endless stress, and constantly having to prove myself. It's been anything but easy. And the idea that Rachel thought it was all luck, that she didn't see the effort behind it, felt like a betrayal. What hurt even more was Mom's response. She didn't defend me or challenge Rachel's words. Instead, she offered comfort. "I know, honey," she said softly. "You've had a tough time, but things will get better. Just hang in there." Hearing that, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a sense of being unseen. It was like all the hard work I'd put into building my life didn't matter. Rachel's struggles seemed to overshadow everything else, and Mom's silence on my behalf felt like validation of Rachel's complaints. That night, I lay in bed replaying the conversation in my head. I didn't know what to do with the feelings it stirred up. Confronting Rachel felt pointless. She'd just dismiss me or turn it into an argument. And talking to Mom? That felt even harder. How do you tell your own mother that you feel overlooked? That no matter how much you achieve, it feels like you'll never measure up to the sibling who always gets the sympathy vote. The worst part was that I couldn't shake the bitterness creeping in. I didn't want to resent Rachel, but her words and actions were making it harder and harder to see her as just my sister. She was becoming a source of stress, a reminder of the things in my family dynamic that didn't feel fair or balanced. I knew I couldn't keep these feelings bottled up forever. Sooner or later, something would have to give. I just didn't realize how soon it would happen, or how much it would change everything. The first week after my promotion was like a dream. My team was excited, my responsibilities expanded, and I felt like I was finally stepping into the kind of role I'd worked so hard for. But just as I was getting comfortable, things started to go wrong. It wasn't immediate, but subtle at first. I noticed a shift in how some of my coworkers interacted with me, quieter greetings, fewer smiles, and shorter conversations. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Promotions can change dynamics, right? Maybe people were just adjusting. Then, one morning, I was called into a meeting with HR. My heart dropped as I walked into the small office with its plain white walls and stiff chairs. The HR representative started by assuring me that this was routine, but quickly moved into the reason for the meeting. There had been anonymous complaints about me. According to the reports, I'd been hostile and unprofessional in several interactions with coworkers. I was stunned. That didn't sound like me at all. In fact, my reputation at work was built on being approachable and easy to work with. I tried to stay calm as I explained that I had no idea where these complaints were coming from. The HR representative nodded and took notes but reminded me that company policy required them to investigate, regardless of my track record. I left the meeting feeling confused and uneasy. Who would say something like that about me? Was it a misunderstanding, or was someone deliberately trying to cause trouble? Either way, it didn't sit right with me. When I returned to my desk, my boss called me into her office. She had heard about the complaints and wanted to let me know that she believed in me. "You've been a model employee," she said. "I don't think these accusations hold water, but we have to follow the process." Her support was reassuring, but it didn't erase the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I kept replaying every recent interaction in my head, trying to figure out if I had unknowingly upset someone. No matter how much I thought about it, nothing made sense. The next blow came a few days later. This time, it was an email. Apparently, someone had forwarded an inappropriate message that I had allegedly sent to a coworker. When HR showed it to me, my jaw dropped. It was vulgar, unprofessional, and completely fabricated. I told them immediately, "This isn't mine. I didn't write this." The HR rep gave me a look that was equal parts skeptical and concerned. "It's coming from your email address," she said. "We'll have it look into it, but this is serious." That night, I barely slept. My mind raced with questions. Who was doing this to me and why? I had always been careful with my work email, never sharing my login or leaving it unsecured. The idea that someone could fake an email from me was terrifying. If it couldn't prove it was fake, my entire career could be at risk. As the days passed, the anxiety only grew. The investigation was ongoing, and every day at work felt like walking on eggshells. My coworkers, who didn't know the details, were clearly picking up on the tension. Some avoided me altogether, while others looked at me with a mix of curiosity and pity. It was humiliating. I was used to being respected at work, and now it felt like I was under a microscope. Then, one night, as I was lying in bed replaying everything in my head, something clicked. Rachel. Her bitter comment during dinner, the way she vented to Mom about my luck, it all came rushing back. Could she be behind this? It seemed far-fetched, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Rachel was tech-savvy enough to pull something like this off, and she definitely had the motive. The idea that my own sister might be sabotaging me was hard to wrap my head around, but at this point I couldn't ignore the possibility. I started paying closer attention to Rachel during my visits to my parents' house. One evening, she asked me a series of questions that set off alarm bells. "So, does your company track emails closely?" she asked, feigning casual curiosity. "What happens if someone makes a complaint? Do they investigate thoroughly?" Her tone was light, but the questions were oddly specific. I answered cautiously, trying not to let on that I was suspicious. The moment she left the room, I felt my heart racing. It couldn't be a coincidence, could it? The next day, I reached out to our IT department and asked them to dig deeper into the email issue. I explained that I suspected it had been sent from outside the company, using a spoofed email address. They agreed to look into it, and I waited anxiously for their findings. In the meantime, I started to connect the dots in my own way. If Rachel was behind this, she had to be using a device connected to our parents' Wi-Fi. I wasn't sure how to prove it, but I was determined to find out. As much as I didn't want to believe it, my gut told me Rachel was responsible. If I was right, this wasn't just sibling rivalry anymore, it was sabotage. And the worst part, I had no idea how far she was willing to go. After weeks of walking on eggshells and feeling the walls close in, I decided I couldn't sit back any longer. The stakes were too high. This wasn't just about my reputation, it was about my career, my livelihood. The idea that Rachel might be behind it lingered in the back of my mind, but I needed proof. Without it, confronting her would only lead to more denial and accusations. So I started piecing things together myself. The first thing I did was go over the complaints with HR. They couldn't give me much detail, but they did mention that the accusations were submitted anonymously through an online form. This wasn't surprising, but it gave me an idea. If someone had gone through the trouble of submitting multiple complaints, there might be a trail. I also brought up the fake email again with it, asking if they could trace its origin. "We're working on it," they assured me. These things take time. I didn't have the luxury of waiting, so I decided to dig deeper on my own. Using everything I knew about the situation, I started researching how anonymous emails and complaints could be traced. It wasn't easy, I'm not an expert, but I knew enough to understand the basics. Most anonymous accounts, especially burner emails, are tied to an IP address. That's the digital fingerprint of the device or network used to send the messages. If I could get the IP address linked to the email, I'd have a clue about where it came from. A breakthrough came when it finally got back to me. "We traced the burner email account to an IP address," they said. "It's not tied to our internal network, but it looks like a residential IP." My heart raced. I knew exactly where they were going with this. "Can you tell me the location of the IP?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. After a pause, they responded, "It's linked to an address in your area." That was all I needed to hear. I knew it was my parents' house. Suddenly, everything clicked. Rachel's bitter comments, her oddly specific questions about my workplace policies, and now this. It all lined up too perfectly. She had access to our parents' Wi-Fi, and she clearly had a motive. I wasn't ready to confront her just yet. I needed more evidence, but the realization was like a punch to the gut. My own sister, someone I had grown up with, might actually be trying to sabotage my career. I decided to visit my parents that weekend, not just to see them but to observe Rachel. She was her usual self, casual, sarcastic, and acting like nothing was out of the ordinary. But as we sat around the table, she asked another one of those questions that sent alarm bells ringing. "So, what does your company do if someone submits a complaint but doesn't provide proof?" she asked, pretending to be curious. "Do they just believe it, or do they investigate?" I looked at her closely, trying to read her expression. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She was fishing for information. I answered as vaguely as I could. "They investigate everything," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "It can trace pretty much anything these days." Her face froze for a split second before she forced a laugh. "Good to know," she said, reaching for her glass of water. That tiny moment of hesitation was all I needed to confirm my suspicion. She was nervous, and she should be. That night, I stayed up late, running through everything I knew. The burner email, the IP address, her questions, it all pointed back to Rachel. But what kind of person does something like this to their own sibling? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I had worked so hard to get to where I was, and she was willing to destroy it out of jealousy. It was hard to wrap my head around, but I couldn't let her get away with it. The next day, I asked it for one more favor. I wanted to know if the burner account had been accessed from any other devices. If Rachel had used multiple gadgets, it would strengthen my case. They agreed to look into it, and I waited anxiously for their response. In the meantime, I started planning how I would confront her. This wasn't going to be a casual conversation, it was going to be a reckoning. When it finally got back to me, they confirmed what I already suspected. The burner account had been accessed from multiple devices, all linked to the same IP address. One of the devices even matched the type of laptop Rachel owned. It was the final piece of the puzzle. There was no doubt anymore, Rachel was the one behind everything. As I sat in my car outside my parents' house, I took a deep breath and tried to calm my nerves. This wasn't going to be easy. Rachel and I had always had our differences, but this was different. She had crossed a line, and I couldn't ignore it. I had the evidence, and I was ready to confront her. The only question was, how would she react? That Sunday evening, we all gathered for dinner at my parents' house. It was one of those routine family meals where everyone pretends life is normal, even when it's not. Mom had prepared a feast, and Dad was busy serving drinks while Mark cracked jokes to lighten the mood. Rachel was there, too, sitting across from me with that same casual smirk she always wore, completely unaware of what was coming. My stomach churned, not because of what I was about to say, but because of how it might shatter everything between us. Halfway through dinner, I set down my fork and cleared my throat. "I need to say something," I began, my voice steady but firm. The room went quiet, all eyes on me. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder, the one holding all the evidence I'd gathered over the past week. "Rachel," I said, looking directly at her, "I know what you've been doing." She blinked, her expression shifting from confusion to forced indifference. "What are you talking about?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "Don't play dumb," I replied, sliding the folder across the table. "These are the complaints, the fake email, and the IP address that ties everything back to this house. To you." The room was dead silent as Rachel stared at the folder. Mom and Dad exchanged confused looks, while Mark sat frozen, his usually relaxed demeanor replaced with unease. Rachel, however, didn't even flinch. She pushed the folder away without opening it and laughed, though it sounded more nervous than amused. "You're seriously accusing me what? Hacking your work? That's ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous, Rachel," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I traced the burner email. I know it was accessed from this house from your devices. I even asked it to confirm it. You can deny it all you want, but the proof is right there." Her smirk faltered, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her confidence. "You're crazy," she muttered, but her tone was shaky. "Why would I do something like that?" "That's what I'd like to know," I shot back. "Why would you go out of your way to sabotage me? What did I ever do to you that was so terrible?" Rachel's denial didn't last long. As the weight of the evidence sank in, her defiance gave way to frustration. She slammed her hands on the table, startling everyone. "Fine," she snapped. "Yes, I did it. Are you happy now?" The room erupted into chaos. Mom gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, while Dad demanded an explanation. Mark looked at Rachel like she was a stranger, unable to process what he'd just heard. As for me, I felt a mix of anger and relief. At least she'd admitted it, but her confession didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. Rachel stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "You want to know why?" she shouted. "Because you've always been the favorite. Everyone thinks you're so perfect, with your stupid promotions and your perfect little life. I just wanted people to see that you're not as great as you pretend to be." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This was about jealousy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You nearly cost me my job because you're jealous of me?" Rachel crossed her arms, refusing to meet my gaze. "You don't get it," she muttered. "You've always had it so easy. Mom and Dad never criticize you. They never ask if you're okay, because they just assume you're fine. Meanwhile, I'm the one they pity, the one who always screws up." Mom tried to intervene, her voice shaky. "Rachel, that's not true. We love all of you equally. Do you?" Rachel shot back, her eyes flashing. "Because it sure doesn't feel that way." Dad finally spoke, his tone stern but controlled. "Rachel, what you did was wrong. I don't care how you feel about your brother. Sabotaging his career is inexcusable. You owe him an apology." Rachel rolled her eyes, but before she could say anything, I cut in. "I don't want a fake apology. I said firmly. I want you to take responsibility for what you did. Do you even realize how close I came to losing everything? My job, my reputation, everything I've worked for. And for what? Because you felt overshadowed? Rachel didn't respond. She just stood there, arms crossed, looking at the floor. The silence was deafening. Mom finally spoke, her voice trembling. This isn't who we are as a family. We don't tear each other down like this. Well, maybe we should have talked about that sooner, Rachel muttered, turning to leave the room. I'm done here. She stormed out, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. Mom looked like she might cry, while Dad just shook his head in disappointment. Mark finally broke the silence. I don't even know what to say, he admitted. This is insane. I didn't know what to say either. Part of me wanted to chase after Rachel and demand more answers, but the other part of me was too drained to care. The damage was done, and no amount of talking would fix it. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't stop replaying the confrontation in my head. Rachel's words, her confession, her anger, it all felt surreal. I knew our relationship would never be the same, but I also knew I couldn't let this break me. If anything, it made me more determined to protect what I'd worked so hard for. After Rachel stormed out of the dining room, the rest of us sat there in stunned silence. My dad was the first to speak, his voice heavy with disappointment. I can't believe she would do something like this, he said, shaking his head. I raised all of you to support each other, not tear each other down. I nodded, still too angry to form a coherent response. My hands were trembling as I replayed Rachel's confession in my mind. How could she justify something so cruel? How could she take all her insecurities and turn them into an attack on me? The betrayal cut deep, and I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. Mom, however, was quick to jump to Rachel's defense. She's under so much stress, she said, her voice trembling. Losing her job, moving back home, it's been so hard on her. She's not thinking clearly. I stared at her in disbelief. Stress doesn't give her the right to ruin my life, Mom, I snapped. She almost cost me my job. Do you even realize how serious this is? She didn't mean for it to go that far, Mom insisted. You're both adults. Can't you just work this out? Work this out? Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Work this out? I repeated, my voice rising. Mom, this isn't a small argument. She sabotaged me. She lied. She manipulated. And she tried to destroy everything I've built. How do you expect me to just brush that off? My dad spoke up again, his tone firm. Your mom's wrong on this one, he said, turning to her. Rachel crossed a line and she needs to be held accountable. This isn't something we can sweep under the rug. Mom looked torn, like she didn't know whose side to take. She's your sister, she said softly. She's struggling, and maybe this was her way of crying out for help. No, I said sharply. This was her way of trying to tear me down because she couldn't handle her own failures. And now you're excusing it like it's no big deal. Mark, who had been unusually quiet, finally chimed in. Look, I get that Rachel's going through a rough time, he said carefully. But this is messed up. I don't think I've ever been this disappointed in her. Eventually, Rachel came back downstairs. Her face was flushed, and she looked more annoyed than remorseful. Fine, she said, crossing her arms. I'm sorry, okay? I didn't think it would blow up like this. That's not an apology, I said, glaring at her. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught. She rolled her eyes. Oh, come on. Don't act like this ruined your life. You're still the perfect golden boy, aren't you? Everyone's on your side, as usual. Her words stung, but I refused to let her bait me. This isn't about sides, Rachel, I said through gritted teeth. It's about what you did. You crossed a line, and now you're trying to shift the blame instead of taking responsibility. Rachel shrugged, her tone dismissive. I said I'm sorry. What else do you want from me? I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. I want you to understand the damage you've done, I said quietly. But clearly you don't. The rest of the evening was a blur. My dad tried to mediate, but the tension was too thick. Mom kept defending Rachel, saying things like she's going through a tough time, and you don't know how hard it is for her. Every time she said that, I felt my frustration grow. Why did Rachel's struggles always excuse her behavior? Why did my achievements always seem to mean less in comparison? By the time I left, the family felt more divided than ever. Dad and Mark were firmly on my side, while Mom seemed determined to shield Rachel from the consequences of her actions. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the weight of it all. This wasn't just about Rachel's betrayal. It was about the cracks in our family dynamic that had been there all along. Over the next few days, I kept my distance from everyone. I needed time to process what had happened and figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to cut Rachel out of my life completely, but another part of me struggled with the idea. She was my sister, after all. But how do you forgive someone who doesn't even seem sorry? I decided to focus on clearing my name at work first. With its help, I presented the evidence to HR and my boss, proving that the complaints and the email were fabricated. They were relieved, and I was assured that my job was safe. But even with that weight lifted, I couldn't shake the lingering resentment toward Rachel. Back at home, things were tense. Dad called to check on me and told me he'd had a long talk with Rachel. She knows she messed up, he said, but it's going to take time for her to really face what she's done. Mom, on the other hand, kept asking me to forgive Rachel. She's your sister, she kept saying, as if that was supposed to erase everything. But I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The days following the confrontation were some of the hardest I've ever experienced. My mind kept replaying Rachel's words, her half-hearted apology, and the way Mom seemed more concerned with excusing her behavior than addressing the harm she'd caused. I felt like I was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions, anger, disappointment, and sadness all tangled together. But as much as I wanted to move past it, I knew I couldn't just pretend nothing had happened. something needed to change. I made a decision. I was cutting Rachel out of my life until she truly understood the consequences of her actions. It wasn't easy to come to this conclusion. She's my sister, someone I've known my entire life. But what she did went beyond a simple sibling rivalry. She jeopardized my career, my reputation, and my peace of mind. And worse, she showed no real remorse. If I allowed her behavior to go unchecked, it would only give her the green light to do it again. I sat down with my parents to explain my decision. I can't keep doing this, I told them. I won't tolerate toxic behavior, even from family. I need to focus on my mental health and my career, and that means setting boundaries. Mom looked heartbroken. She's your sister, she said for what felt like the 100th time. Family is supposed to stick together. Family doesn't sabotage each other, I replied, my voice firm. I'm not saying I'll never speak to her again, but until she owns up to what she did and makes a genuine effort to fix things, I can't have her in my life. It's not healthy for me. Dad nodded in agreement. He's right, he said, his tone serious. Rachel crossed a line and we can't keep excusing her behavior. She needs to learn that actions have consequences. Mom didn't respond, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to protect both of her children, even when one of them was clearly in the wrong. I felt bad for putting her in this position, but I knew I had to stand my ground. Allowing Rachel back into my life without accountability would only perpetuate the cycle. Meanwhile, at work, things were slowly returning to normal. The IT team had done a thorough investigation and confirmed that the fake email and anonymous complaints were fabricated. I presented the findings to HR and my boss, who were both relieved to see my name cleared. My boss pulled me aside after the meeting and said, I never doubted you for a second. You've always been one of our most reliable employees. Her words meant more to me than I could express. For weeks, I'd been walking around with a cloud over my head, feeling like my reputation had been tarnished. Knowing that my boss and coworkers still believed in me was a huge relief. It also reminded me of why I needed to protect my professional life at all costs. This was my career, something I'd worked tirelessly to build. I couldn't let anyone, not even Rachel, jeopardize it. With my job secure, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But there was still a lot of emotional baggage to unpack. Cutting off contact with Rachel wasn't just about setting boundaries, it was also about reclaiming my sense of self-worth. For years, I'd let her bitterness and sarcasm chip away at my confidence. This was my way of saying, enough. I didn't block Rachel's number or cut her off completely, but I made it clear that I wasn't interested in speaking to her until she was ready to take responsibility for her actions. When she texted me a few days later, I read the message but didn't respond. It was more of the same, excuses and deflections. I was under so much pressure, she wrote. You don't understand what it's like to feel like a failure. I wanted to reply, to tell her that sabotaging me wasn't the way to deal with her insecurities. But I stopped myself. Responding would only drag me back into the drama, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I focused on the things that mattered, my work, my friends, and my own well-being. Mom called me a few times, trying to act as a mediator. She's trying, she said during one of our conversations. She's just not very good at expressing it. I need more than effort, Mom, I told her. I need her to own up to what she did and make things right. Until then, I'm keeping my distance. The hardest part was dealing with the guilt. Cutting off a family member, even temporarily, felt wrong on so many levels. But every time I doubted my decision, I reminded myself of what was at stake. This wasn't just about me, it was about setting a precedent for how I expected to be treated by family or anyone else. In the weeks that followed, I started to feel more like myself again. Without the constant tension with Rachel hanging over me, I was able to focus on the things that brought me joy. I threw myself into my work, took time to catch up with friends, and even started picking up old hobbies I'd neglected. I wasn't sure if Rachel would ever truly understand the gravity of what she'd done. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let her bitterness define me. This was my life, and I was taking control of it. The weeks after I set boundaries with Rachel were quiet but tense. I didn't reach out to her, and she didn't try to call me either. It was like an unspoken agreement to avoid each other, but the silence didn't erase the damage. Whenever I spoke to my parents, her name would inevitably come up. Mom would mention how distant she'd been or how upset she seemed, but I held my ground. I wasn't ready to mend bridges with someone who hadn't taken responsibility for trying to tear me down. Rachel wasn't just at odds with me. Her relationship with Dad took a hit too. He couldn't look at her the same way after the confrontation. While he didn't cut her off like I did, his disappointment was clear. He told me once, I don't know where we went wrong with her. I raised her to be better than this. It was hard to hear, but I knew it wasn't his fault. Rachel's actions were her own, and she had to live with the consequences. Socially, Rachel seemed to isolate herself. She stopped posting on social media, and when I asked Mark about her, he said she rarely left the house. She's moody, he told me, but I think she's starting to realize she messed up. For me, the decision to distance myself was the right one, even if it wasn't easy. There were moments when I felt guilty, like I should be the bigger person and try to fix things. But then I'd remember how close I came to losing my job, how much stress and anxiety she caused me, and I'd remind myself that family loyalty doesn't mean tolerating betrayal. It's a tough lesson to learn, especially when it comes to family. Growing up, we're taught that family is everything, that you should always forgive and move on. But what happens when family becomes the source of your pain? I realized that forgiveness is one thing, but letting someone continue to hurt you is another. Setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about teaching Rachel that her actions had consequences. Reflecting on everything, I started to see how much I had let Rachel's opinions affect me over the years. Her constant sarcasm, her passive-aggressive comments, it all chipped away at my confidence without me even realizing it. Cutting her out of my life gave me the space to heal and rebuild that confidence. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself instead of trying to prove something to her. At work, I threw myself into new projects and embraced my promotion. The fallout with Rachel, as painful as it was, gave me a new perspective on what really mattered. My career wasn't just a way to pay the bills, it was something I was proud of, something I had built with my own hard work. No one could take that away from me, not even Rachel. I also started focusing more on my personal life. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd neglected, and even started going to therapy. Talking to a professional helped me process the complicated emotions surrounding Rachel and my family. It wasn't just about what she did, it was about years of feeling overshadowed by her, about always being compared and never feeling fully seen. Therapy helped me let go of that baggage and focus on what I could control, my own happiness. As time went on, I began to hear small updates about Rachel. Mom would tell me she was looking for a new job or that she was thinking about moving out. I didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any advice. I wasn't ready to let her back into my life, but I hoped she was taking steps to change. Whether she did or not wasn't up to me anymore. One day, months later, Rachel sent me a text. It was short and to the point. "I'm sorry for everything. I know I hurt you, and I'm working on being better." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure if it was genuine or if she was just trying to patch things up for appearances. But even if it wasn't enough to repair our relationship, it felt like a step in the right direction. Looking back on everything, I've learned a lot about myself and about family. It's easy to get caught up in the idea that family should come first, no matter what. But the truth is, sometimes you have to put yourself first. You can love someone and still recognize that they're toxic for you. You can forgive someone without letting them back into your life. For now, I'm focused on moving forward. My career is in a great place, and I've learned how to prioritize my own well-being. Rachel and I may never have the relationship we once had, but that's okay. What matters is that I've found peace, and I'm no longer carrying the weight of her resentment on my shoulders. Sometimes, the best thing you can do for yourself is to let go, and that's exactly what I've done.